Good evening. This is a slightly different edition of A Cup of Coffee with Bill. Want to do a couple of episodes with sellers, and we're a uh, we're a breed of grinders. And when you want to talk to sellers, you take the hours that sellers aren't selling. And so we're going to change from cup of coffee to glass of Guinness with Pete Kahler, who is the director of sponsorship sales with JMI Sports at the MAC conference. Pete, welcome to the show.
Bill, cheers. Looking forward to this.
Cheers. So, Pete, just for people that aren't familiar with you and JMI, can you give us just a 30-second elevator pitch on yourself and a little bit about JMI Sports?
Sure. I tend to talk too much, so here's my quick 30 seconds. Um, I am a former basketball coach, collegiate basketball coach / staff member for 12 years that got out of the coaching ranks. And what's the one skill set that translates best to the sports business world is sales. And JMI offered me an opportunity about a year ago to come be the director of sales, sponsorship sales for their Mid-American Conference property, which they just obtained and got the marketing rights to this past July 1st of 2020. So for those who are not familiar with the selling of marketing rights for the collegiate space, oftentimes, I would say probably about 90% of the time, those rights are sold to an agency in return of some kind of revenue or revenue share. IMG College, Learfield IMG College, probably the biggest one that everybody knows about. JMI Sports, we're very much in that same vein. We like to think of ourselves perhaps a little bit differently, and there's some different avenues that we're also involved in. But one of their strategic goals was to start acquiring and partnering with collegiate conferences, not just the teams. So the MAC is one of the 5 conferences that we now represent the rights to, including the Mountain West, the Ivy League, the Patriot League, and the Southern Conference. So I'm really happy to be back here at the MAC. I'm a MAC guy. I used to coach in the MAC. Got my start at Ohio University as a grad student, and I'm bringing partnerships to the table for a conference that I love, with people that I love at the conference offers. It's a really great opportunity for me, not just professionally, but personally too, because me and my wife both have a lot of family here in the Cleveland area.
Yeah,
That was 3 minutes, not 30 seconds.
it was a Kahler 30 seconds. Well, that's what we'll call that one. So you brought it up. The MAC just switched who their multimedia rights holder was. How's that been coming in not too long after that deal was signed to the conference? Not even, we'll say, absent of the pandemic, but what was that like, and were there any hurdles starting off selling for a new rights holder after leaving somebody like a Learfield IMG?
Yeah, I think, again, just for people listening, this is in some ways, I grew up in the sponsorship space, I should mention, and very familiar with the ins and outs of it, but from a job actually being paid to do it perspective, directly, this is my first time. So I can imagine that the things and challenges I faced in terms of the switchover are very, very common to anybody who's been in this situation before. They're just amplified tremendously by the COVID challenges. Mm-hmm. For example, something as little as not being able to get Excel files because they're on somebody's desk, but nobody can go into the office to get the desk because it's the middle of the pandemic and you're working from home. The changeover to something as big as just understanding the full list of who the former partners were and where did they stand in terms of make goods and stuff, because the pandemic happened I think they played 3 games of the women's basketball championship. Mm-hmm. Where did that relationship leave with all those partners? I think that was the hardest challenge, is trying to bridge those relationships in the midst of a pandemic while trying to also navigate new business when nobody is spending any dollars because you are in the middle of a pandemic. So I think it was just nothing unique in terms of that changeover. I think it was just greatly magnified due to the fact that it was right in the middle of the pandemic. I will say this for anybody listening, I can give him a shout out. Tom Sitko was the guy who he still is at the Kent State property,
Mm-hmm.
at IMG College. He was more than gracious and helpful and changing over and providing me with as much information as appropriate. And grateful for him and also everybody at the MAC for just trying to make it as smooth as possible. I think it could have been a lot worse if there wasn't as much communication between the MAC, JMI, and actually the former rights holder. I think it was important to know that we're all in this together. Learfield IMG College still has 10 of the 12 schools that are MAC schools. And it's actually been really grateful to get to know Tom as this has gone down the road in different ways we can help one another.
Right. Now that and you brought up a good point, and let's just jump into it. Selling during a pandemic, you start with JMI and the conference in April of 2020. Now we're almost a year later. What were some of the things that you had to do differently as a sponsorship seller than you normally would do? Because I think back to SBJ podcast I listened to late last week, talking to, and I forget the names. I know one of them is Bobcat alum, and so I feel terrible about forgetting their name. But talking about trying to sell naming rights and some other larger sponsorships, and one factor they didn't necessarily bring into the equation until someone told them was, you're trying to sell to CMOs and CEOs who theoretically their jobs could potentially be on the line if they make a misstep, like spending the wrong amount of money on a marketing piece when they've got to try to figure out the bottom line. So walk me through some of the things that you faced selling during a pandemic, and how you've probably pivoted to be a better seller at this point now that you've got a year under your belt, all in a pandemic.
Yeah, I think the challenges are you have to establish relationships quickly for somebody, because it's not that you're green again, but that you're on this side of the coin. So that was my first challenge as a seller, was how do I forge relationships in a pandemic when those people that you're referring to, whether they might be letting staff go, furloughing people, or furlough themselves, specifically, trying to find some old hotel partners. There's a lot of people in the hotel industry that were furloughed for a long time, among others. So the challenging thing for me was how do I establish that relationship, and quickly, because my sales cycle is not of a typical year. And then once I establish that relationship, be very mindful of the fact that they probably don't have as much, or if any, sponsorship dollars for this coming year. But that doesn't mean that relationship is going to go away.
Right.
There are some people that were, doing things specifically for just tickets and hospitality. And it was pretty clear early on that we weren't going to have that for football. Mm-hmm. So how do I establish that relationship? So if I get something, but if not something, I know that I'm in the right position to be there to ask the following year. That's the biggest challenge. Outside of the more obvious one was that we didn't have any title sponsor for football or basketball. And with the clock was ticking, it was challenging to identify in that market who had money to spend for such a big ask and be appropriate to ask. Because again, you didn't want to burn bridges. And I think navigating that was something that I turned heavily to for people within my network. Mm-hmm. If people don't know, you and I both went to Ohio University for grad school, and it was the Bobcat network, but then also people through, Michigan and other places I've been at, who were really helpful in saying, hey, who would be a good idea? It's a good fit. Because if it wasn't for that, I think that's still to this day one of the biggest challenges. You don't want to burn bridges and figure out at the conference level, because it's only really two events for most conferences, football and basketball, that you have these big events to sell for. who's going to have interest in that when everybody's marketing budgets is being slashed or non-existent? And that's something we're working with even today as we try to go in this recovery mode.
What, and not that we planned to talk about it, but you brought it up a little early on in our discussion, and I think it's relevant. Talk to me about the make goods, because that's something that I find fascinating, especially in our line of work. I look at leagues like the NHL, where they're implementing new uniform sponsored patches, but they're not necessarily sure if those are going to stay or if they're going to go next year. And then ultimately, what's the real value of some of these assets? How have you been navigating with make goods at the conference level, and what's kind of your forecast of where you might finally see some of your assets that you have available get back to their true value versus what you might be waiting them at for, ultimately the purpose of making good on contract?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was the silver lining of a bad situation, was that I didn't have any make goods, because our books are clean of all the previous marketing rights holder. This is all new business in a sense. So even if it's a renewal in the sense that it's still going to be working with the MAC. This is all new business technically, right, for AMI. So I was under no obligation to fulfill anything from anything that got missed out for the basketball tournament. Mm-hmm. That being said, the fact that they didn't, that had to be navigated through the previous rights holder, they did a fine job, and they have multiple properties and ways to figure that out. It leaves a sour taste, and not just a conference level, but everybody's, it leaves a sour taste that they weren't able to get what they paid for, and it's, almost buyer's remorse. And I think that was across the industry, that everybody had the same kind of story of that. So moving forward, I think we have to be creative as an industry. We were able to have our football game and fulfill all of our obligations. And, in the case of a Rocket Mortgage, one of the good ways of doing that in real time is that you can adjust. The COVID issues for having a championship football game in real time is that you might not be able to paint this end zone or this area or anywhere else in the field like you typically would, because the NFL has to hold the Lions Stadium readily available for Sunday football after your championship game, even if there isn't a Lions game, but it's just because it's a COVID reserve site in case of emergency. Things that will probably and hopefully never happen again in this industry, where it's last minute details, that we were being flexible. I think I would like to think that I would navigate that same way. As, is it the true value? No, but I think it's in a true partnership sense, not just a sponsorship sense, but a true partnership that you're going to work with one another to get over those little hurdles, and make good, in the sense of whether it's from a previous deal or, in my case, something that's live in the moment. When do things come back to that true value? I don't know. In some circumstances, if they ever will. And at the same time, they might be even more valuable depending on how you're positioning certain things. I think hospitality, and talking to some people, has even more value now than maybe it did 2-3 years before the pandemic, because coming up for this fall season, I think there's going to be a great desire and need to want to have corporate hospitality for partners at certain events, like a MAC football championship game at Ford Field. Other things, maybe not as much. And I think it's going to be recalibrated, like what the true value is. And I think that's something that agencies, analytic companies are all looking into right now as we move forward. And as a sales guy, it's my job to, provide that value, whether it's through quantitative or qualitative, reasoning.
To go back to the, the idea of building relationships, what are you going to take away from where we've all been at this point and doing a lot of stuff over Zoom and the different virtual meeting spaces, and maybe some of the tools that you've been utilizing to try to do as much as you can that you normally would in a physical meeting? What are you going to carry over moving forward that you think fits into the toolkit when you're able to start going back into conference rooms to talk with CMOs and CEOs in person?
Yeah, I think the greatest thing I was just first off, Bill, you're going to hear me. I spent 12 years in the coaching world, so one of the things we always talk about scouting reports is KYP, know your personnel. Depending on the client, I think some people are going to be more comfortable always going over Zoom, regardless of COVID concerns or whether or not you've been vaccinated, or even if you're meeting in person. And if that's their comfort zone, I think as salespeople, we have to identify that quickly and figure out what works and what doesn't. So what I've understood in this is that I've become a better person presenting over PowerPoint, because as you noticed throughout this, I talk too much. That having a hard meeting time on Zoom, that 30 minutes, it's having that score clock in front of me, like boom, 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 I have to do it. Whereas I think in person, people tend to maybe ramble on a little bit more because it's a natural set. Maybe you're following up with lunch afterwards or something like that. It's just more of an open-ended schedule. The Zoom world we live in is very hard. Hey, I got a hard stop at 10:30 because I got to get on the next call with my boss about what you just pitched at me.
Right.
So you have to be more efficient with your time. And that's one thing I think I'll take away from this. But I also think that there's a healthy mix of people out there of old school that will want to get a cup of coffee in the morning, shoot the shit a little bit for an hour or so in the morning and build that relationship. And that's the way they do business. That's the way they can continue to do. So I look at this much like I would recruiting or scouting. You got to know my personnel. I got to know what people from agencies and brands like to communicate that way. But it has taught me how to be more efficient with my time.
Have you found in the same SBJ interview that I referenced a few minutes ago, it was Scott Malaga is who I was thinking of. He brought up that he actually was able to get, in most cases, better access to the top level executives that he would need for meetings. And in a lot of cases, he said, all at the same meeting instead of over several meetings, because it was virtual. Did you find yourself in a similar situation, or did you still find yourself piecing together multiple meetings to make the pitch?
I think generally in the industry, that's very true. I definitely experienced that. But since my Rolodex is so much smaller than most, and I'm still building those relationships on the brand side, I found it that it did take a little bit longer. But overall, I was shocked at the couple of times I did have the CEO, I did have the CMO, or maybe they were together right away. I can think of an example. I don't think he'll mind me saying this. Larry Burns from the Children's Foundation in Michigan, and his CMO on there, like first call right away. Hey, I was like, oh, this is like my first weekend. Like, this is pretty easy. Not all were like that, but it's a very relevant point that what my not concern, but something I'll be aware of is if people get Zoom fatigue, because I do think that that is occurring right now. And I do wonder if that phenomenon will keep going, or if they'll just, I see a lot more people now muting their screens, their video screens during these meetings than it was in the beginning when everybody, was talking about purpose camera placement. Now I see people take out their cell phone in the car and be on meetings and stuff like that. I don't foresee that to be going on much longer. I think sooner or later, as people start going to the offices, you'll stop seeing as much of that. And that indicates to me that maybe there is a little bit of Zoom fatigue out there.
Yeah, that's, I think that's more the challenge on our end, is how do we take the virtual space and try to mitigate some of that, because it is, I'm sick of it. And I say that as we're talking on Zoom right now. That's how I've recorded all of my podcasts to date. And that's how I communicate with anybody right now outside of my part-time work. So it does present a challenge to us, but that's a good point. So let's shift gears. We've talked about some of the hurdles you've dealt with and the challenges, but what about the successes? I think definitely not having to deal with make goods and trying to take any of those issues and turn them into relationship building opportunities is one that we can chalk up to a success. But what other successes can you share with us that you found in first year of JMI and the Mac?
Yeah, I think that The biggest, this sounds like this is a shout out to the MAC. It's the recent one. We just had our MAC men's and women's basketball tournament, and we were able to play all 14 games and not have to worry about make goods. And we were able to fulfill and exceed all things possible for all of our partners at the tournament. We were able to utilize the Cavs on-court signage that they bought for a COVID world. So we had NBA materials, signage, presentation to work. And we had over 2,000 fans, our max capacity allowed for the Friday and Saturday nights. So that sounds like minuscule, but if you look across the board, not every conference had that. They had to cancel some games and stuff. So that's the most recent one. From a selling standpoint, by far our most success was bringing Rocket Mortgage on board as a partner to be our title sponsor of the football championship game. And that was big for me, just as somebody who's lived in Detroit for the last 4 years, how much they do in their community, working with other people and coming up with a concept that we'll get much more PR next year, that we had the $1 million kickoff return, in which if either the opening kickoff or the first or second half is returned, Rocket Mortgage was going to donate $1 million to the charity of their choice. This previous year, it was to one of the Rocket Mortgage's nonprofits they work with, which identifies homelessness across the country, specifically military people, military veterans who are homeless. While that didn't happen, it was the kickoff didn't happen, obviously. It was just a sign of how they're going to be a great partner with the MAC, and not only helping to keep the game in Detroit, because there was that was a big reason of we didn't have a titles partner, and they came on at the 11th hour. But what they do is uniquely Rocket and uniquely different. And we like to think of ourselves at the MAC as uniquely different as well. Whether it's a midweek MACtion, which everybody loves. What's better?
First delight.
Tuesday evening in middle of November to watch two teams kick it off and probably put up 50 points each, or having a different social media presence that's embraced by different people, whether it's like the guys at Barstool or elsewhere. I think that's a very healthy partnership on every level that's going to just keep on growing, and it's been off to a great success, and we're looking forward to working with them for multiple years as the title partner of our football championship game, which will continue to be played at Ford Field.
A fantastic venue. Want to say the last MAC championship game I went to, when the Bobcats, I think we unfortunately lost to Buffalo that year, but great game, great venue, in an iconic sports town. So congrats on locking Rocket Mortgage in for that game. But I think good year one, given the circumstances that you were.
Yeah, and it helps sow seeds, and we're trying. Part of our business, it's not secret. I hope everybody here listens, and they give me a call. We are trying to embed ourselves with the businesses in the city of Cleveland, where our two major championships, I don't like to use the word major, our two neutral championships are held. All of our other championships at the MAC are held on site at campus locations. So the city of Detroit and the city of Cleveland are two places that are near and dear, not only to my heart, but to different business communities that have been giving to the MAC for years. And we're looking to, not reinvent, but reinvigorate that enthusiasm for MAC fandom around them, where they're both, sports moments on the calendar for both cities. It presents a great opportunity for brands in those cities to be a part of it, but then also to recognize the reach, where it's not just a local, it's at that national level. The football game had one of the highest ratings ever in the last 10 years at least, from a football coverage. So it's something that we're going to be bringing ancillary events around as well, whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion events, esports, and just some other fun things that partners like Rocket are going to help market and make it more available. So we're really looking to embed ourselves with the businesses in the Detroit and Cleveland communities.
That's great. So we're going to jump. I've got two quick questions to get your thoughts on, and then a couple of questions so we can get to know you a little better. First, how are you? It doesn't have to be a long answer. How are you looking at name, image, and likeness from the conference level?
We're looking at it like everybody else, waiting to hear how it's going to be. So I'm not going to try to lecture anybody here on what we're going to do, because I don't think anybody truly knows what they're going to do. Um, we're taping this on a Tuesday night. The hearings are being presented tomorrow at the Supreme Court. It's going to affect us on so many multiple levels, and not just the conference level, because we work for the institutions, and the institutions are going to obviously have much more impact at those property at the individual schools. So I think it's going to be really important, more than anything else, how we're looking at this is being together and in communication of how to proceed once we know which direction that's going to be. And with Commissioner Steinbrecher, Eric Judson, our CEO at JMI Sports, I'm very confident that the leadership will be pointed in the right direction, because it's obviously going to have many things to impact on the business side.
June and July could be interesting time for you, depending.
Yeah, and if anything, what we learned this past year is how to adjust on the fly. So I think that's, whether it's from the coaching world or this, throwing together a football championship that got replayed when the season comes on with 2 months worth of prep time, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Last quick shot before we get to some other questions. What are your thoughts on sports gaming partners, especially given Maction? It's gambler's delight during the weekdays. You can't go on Twitter without seeing somebody talk about how heavy the over is being slammed for certain football games or basketball games. Just quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it coming to the collegiate level in an appropriate way. As a former coach, you want people to be out in the open and talking about things. You don't want to be hidden. So I think there's a real opportunity for the gaming industry to come on board at the sponsorship level. It's something that needs to be talked about from the positivities more, about how we can come to light and educate kids about why they should not be betting if you're playing on sport. Mm-hmm. And then educating athletic departments is just as important, I think. So the education that comes with that partnership, much like anything else, like responsible drinking, that comes with a alcohol sponsorship, is something that has been done before, and I think will be done. Keeping your eyes on the gaming, it's just too big, and something that I'm hoping that we can lean into sooner rather than later, because it's out there. There's legislature that will likely be brought to the Ohio State House by the end of August to make gambling legal and sports gambling legal in the state of Ohio. It's already legal in the state of Michigan and Illinois and Indiana, which and New York is about to as well, which will cover all 12 of our schools. So I'm hopeful that it's ways that we can change the narrative, so it's not just, hey, they're here to give us money. It's like, no, let's educate these people and then show our worth to brands about how we can work at the conference level to educate and promote what they're doing in a safe way.
Awesome. No, it's coming, just like you said, a matter of how it's positioned in the collegiate space in a careful manner. All right, so we'll wrap this up with 3 quick questions so we can get to know Pete Kahler a little bit better. First question, Pete, what are you reading right now?
All right, so you prepped me for this. Normally, I'm not that intellectual. I read an author named John Sanford. It's like a murder mystery type deal. Always a sucker for that. But recently, some guys I used to work with at Michigan started a book club in COVID. Never joined a book club. And they got me reading a book called Mornings on Horseback. And it's by David McCall. It's an older book, but it's about Theodore Roosevelt Jr. And his family, before he became president. So it's about his upbringing in New York City right after the Civil War. And it's, so far, I got about a third of it left, but I've learned more in this past book than most I've read from murder mysteries.
I'm reading one about the one of the largest wildfires in U.S. history in 1910 in the Bitterroot Mountain Range out in the West, but it cemented Roosevelt's need for why he created the National Forest Service and having forest rangers to protect public lands. So coincidentally, you brought up a Roosevelt themed book.
Yeah, I will give a shout out. The best book I read during COVID was Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. Even if you don't like some of his other things like Blink or David versus Goliath, I would highly recommend it. In this day and age we live in, it's a really, really important book to read. I've gifted it to several people and clients.
It's on the list. Next question, who are you following? And it can be an influencer, a thought leader, an athlete, whoever you're just keeping your eye on.
Great. This sounds corny, but one guy I've always watched to as an influencer is Vince McMahon. So I'm always watching how WWE pivots from a business standpoint. I think people would have laughed at him for their OTT services 10 years ago, and now they just sold it to Peacock. Who's laughing now? So he's always been an influencer. I'm always following. Same with MMA, or whether or not you like his political stance or even their content. I do think the guys at Barstool and Big Cat and Portnoy are very important for me as a brand guy to keep aware of what they're doing, especially since they love the Mac so much.
Yeah, they're always, again, depending on, trying to stay down the middle, but they're always, it seems, ahead of the curve on what's the newest, and that's why they're where they're at right now.
Yeah.
So last question, what do you have your eye on over the next 3 months?
We already talked about it, I think, with gaming and how that's going to impact the collegiate area. It's already started with some sponsorships in Colorado and some other places, but I can have a big eye on that along with esports. Quick shout out to the Esports Collegiate, which is a entity of, we might have to edit this. It is a separate LLC that is owned by the Mid-American Conference. So it's not the Max Esports League. It's a separate LLC known as Esports Collegiate. Mm-hmm. All 12 sports, all 12 institutions of the Max, plus Northeastern University, which just won their League of Legends. And I am going to be watching how we figure out a way to bring collegiate esports to not only fans, but other colleges to make them aware of it, as well as brands.
Interesting. Well, Pete, this has been great. Thank you for helping me kick off my Sellers series of podcasts. Best of luck in year 2 with JMI and the MAC conference. And folks, we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.